The rain started just after dinner, light at first, then steady, tapping against the wide kitchen window of the quiet Chicago house Laura had once been so proud to call home, and she stood at the counter rinsing a glass that was already clean, staring at her own faint reflection because it felt easier than thinking about the silence that had grown between her and her husband Mark over the past few months. The house used to feel warm, full of small talk and shared jokes, but lately it felt like a hotel lobby where two strangers passed each other politely, and she hated how normal that had begun to seem. She had noticed the changes slowly: Mark's late meetings, his phone always face down, the way he smiled at messages but not at her, but she kept telling herself she was imagining things because doubt felt safer than truth, and she did not want to be the kind of woman who searched through devices or asked desperate questions. She dried her hands and leaned against the counter, remembering how different things had been when they first met in Seattle years ago, both divorced, both cautious, both promising honesty above all else, and she wondered when that promise had started to fade, when conversations had turned into schedules, and when goodnight kisses had become quick nods from opposite sides of the bed. Footsteps broke her thoughts, and she looked up to see Ethan standing in the doorway, tall now at 22, no longer the guarded teenager she had met when she married his father. He had grown into a thoughtful young man with steady eyes and a quiet way of speaking, and though their bond had always been respectful rather than close, there was a gentle trust between them that had formed over the years through shared dinners, school stories, and small everyday moments. "Hey," he said softly, stepping into the kitchen as thunder rolled far away, and she gave him a small smile, asking if he wanted something to eat, but he shook his head and leaned against the counter across from her, his expression serious in a way that made her chest tighten because she sensed this was not casual conversation. He hesitated, running a hand through his hair, then said, "Can I ask you something?" And she felt her heartbeat quicken for reasons she could not explain, yet she nodded, telling him he could ask anything, because she believed in being open even when it scared her. He took a breath, looked at the rain for a second as if gathering courage, then met her eyes and asked, "Is Dad seeing someone else?" And the words landed like a sudden crack in glass, sharp and impossible to ignore, and for a moment she simply stared at him, the dish towel slipping from her hand onto the floor while the hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. No one had spoken the fear aloud before, not her friends, not even her own thoughts in clear sentences, and hearing it from Ethan made it real in a way she had tried so hard to avoid. "Why would you think that?" she asked quietly, not because she didn't know the reasons, but because she needed a second to steady herself, and Ethan shifted his weight and said Mark had been different for months, distant, distracted, always texting, stepping outside to take calls, canceling family plans, and he said it carefully, not with anger but with concern, like someone trying to protect something fragile. Laura swallowed, feeling heat rise behind her eyes, and she realized Ethan had been watching more closely than she had thought, that he too had sensed the cracks forming in their home, and she felt both grateful and ashamed, grateful that she was not alone in noticing, ashamed that the illusion she had tried to maintain had fooled no one. She could have lied, could have brushed it off and said everything was fine, but something about the honesty in Ethan's voice made that impossible, and so she whispered, "I don't know," which was the truest answer she had, because she had no proof, only instincts and sleepless nights and the memory of how Mark used to look at her compared to the polite glance he gave her now. Ethan nodded slowly, and in that quiet nod was understanding beyond his years, and she saw how this uncertainty hurt him too, how he was not just a son questioning his father but a young man trying to understand the meaning of loyalty and love. The rain grew heavier, and lightning flashed faintly, illuminating the kitchen in white light for a brief second, and Laura felt exposed, as if the storm outside mirrored the one she had kept hidden inside, and she suddenly realized how lonely she had been carrying these doubts by herself. She had told friends that marriage had seasons, that stress at work could explain distance, that people go through phases, yet deep down she knew this felt different, colder, more final. Ethan stepped closer, his voice softer now, and said he did not want to cause trouble, that he just wanted to know if she was okay, and the kindness in that simple question broke something open in her because no one had asked her that in a long time, not even Mark, and she felt tears well up but forced herself to stay composed, telling him she would figure things out, that adults sometimes struggle, that it did not mean everything was ruined. But even as she spoke, she felt the fragile edge of truth pressing against her words, and she wondered if this was the moment her life began to change, not with shouting or dramatic scenes, but with a quiet question asked in a small kitchen while rain tapped against the glass. Ethan studied her face as if searching for answers she did not have, and she noticed how much he resembled his father yet how different he felt in that moment, more present, more attentive, and she felt a complicated mix of sadness and appreciation, realizing that sometimes support comes from unexpected places. "If something's wrong," he said carefully, "you don't have to pretend for me," and she managed a faint smile, touched by the maturity in his words, and she thanked him, telling him she would be honest if there was something to share, though inside she knew honesty would require courage she was not sure she possessed yet. They stood there for another minute, the air thick with unsaid thoughts, and then Ethan picked up the fallen towel and placed it gently on the counter, a small gesture that felt symbolic somehow, like he was helping her hold things together without even realizing it, and when he finally left the kitchen, the silence returned but it no longer felt empty, it felt charged, aware, as if the house itself had heard the question and was waiting for an answer. Laura looked out at the rain and understood that ignoring her doubts would no longer be possible, that the careful balance she had maintained was shifting, and she felt fear, yes, but also a strange sense of clarity, because sometimes the hardest questions bring light into places we have tried to keep dark, and as thunder rolled again in the distance, she realized that whatever truth lay ahead, it had already begun with one brave question in the quiet kitchen. After the night Ethan asked the question, the house felt different, as if the walls themselves were listening, and Laura moved through her days with a sharper awareness, noticing every small detail she had once ignored, the way Mark kept his phone close even when he showered, the way he stepped outside to take calls, the way his laughter now belonged to someone on a screen instead of to her. She tried to act normal, cooking dinner, asking about his day, mentioning small things about her job at the art gallery downtown, but their conversations felt thin and rushed, like business updates between coworkers rather than words shared by two people who once promised forever. Mark started coming home later, offering quick excuses about meetings and deadlines, and Laura watched him carefully without accusing him, studying his face for signs of guilt or regret, but all she saw was distance, a polite kindness that hurt more than anger would have, because anger at least meant passion still existed. Ethan noticed too, she could tell by the way he observed his father at the dinner table, by the quiet tension in his posture when Mark brushed off questions or checked his phone mid-conversation, and Laura hated that this strain was shaping the atmosphere of the house, turning simple evenings into silent performances where everyone pretended not to see what was right in front of them. One night, long after Mark had gone to bed claiming he was exhausted, Laura stayed downstairs alone, sitting at the kitchen table under the soft yellow light, staring at a cup of tea that had gone cold, and she let herself feel the truth she had been avoiding. She felt lonely in her own marriage. She remembered how Mark used to sit across from her and talk about dreams, about travel plans, about building something steady after both of them had survived painful divorces, and she wondered when those shared dreams had quietly faded into separate routines. Ethan came into the kitchen again, moving quietly so he wouldn't startle her, and without saying much he placed a fresh mug of tea in front of her and sat down across from her, and the simple kindness made her throat tighten because it had been so long since someone had noticed her silence. They talked softly, not about accusations but about life, about Ethan's college classes in Michigan, about the uncertainty of choosing a career path, about how confusing adulthood can feel when expectations do not match reality, and Laura found herself opening up in ways she had not planned, admitting she felt lost, admitting she did not recognize her marriage anymore. "I don't think he sees me," she said quietly, surprised at her own honesty, and Ethan listened without judgment, his expression steady, and he replied in a calm voice that she deserved to be seen, that she worked hard, that she cared deeply, and hearing those words from him filled a space inside her that had been empty for months. She quickly reminded herself of boundaries, of roles, of the importance of keeping their connection healthy and respectful, but she could not deny the comfort she felt in being understood. The days passed quickly, yet every interaction between Laura and Mark felt strained, as if they were circling around a truth neither wanted to face. She tried once to ask him gently if something was wrong between them, but he shrugged it off, saying work was stressful and she was overthinking things, and his dismissive tone stung more than a harsh argument would have, because it made her feel small and unreasonable. Ethan became more present in subtle ways, offering to help with groceries, asking about her gallery events, encouraging her to share stories about artists she admired, and through these conversations Laura began to remember parts of herself that existed beyond being a wife waiting for affection. She laughed more when talking to Ethan, felt lighter for short moments, yet she was careful to keep emotional lines clear, reminding herself that he was family and that her vulnerability must not turn into confusion. One evening, Mark announced another overnight business trip with barely a glance at her, and Laura felt something inside her shift from anxious hope to quiet realization, because the pattern had become too obvious to ignore. After he left, the house felt both calmer and sadder, and she and Ethan sat in the living room with the television on low volume, neither really watching, and he finally said he hated seeing her hurt, that he wished his father would be honest, and Laura felt a wave of gratitude mixed with sorrow, because no young man should have to witness the slow fading of his parents' marriage. She told Ethan that sometimes adults grow apart, that love requires effort from both sides, and she admitted she was tired of being the only one trying. She did not speak with anger but with a steady clarity that surprised her, as if the fog around her heart was beginning to lift. That night, alone in her bedroom, she looked at the empty space beside her and realized she no longer feared the truth as much as she feared living in uncertainty, and she understood that whatever was happening between Mark and this unknown distance, it was not her imagination. The emotional gap had grown too wide. Over the next week, she focused on her work, pouring energy into organizing a new exhibit at the gallery, surrounding herself with creativity and color, and each day she felt a little stronger, less dependent on Mark's attention for validation. Ethan noticed the change and smiled when she described a painting she loved, and in his quiet support she found a reminder that connection can be simple and respectful, built on listening rather than secrecy. Yet beneath this growing strength, tension still lingered, because she knew the situation could not remain suspended forever. Something would have to break, either the silence or the marriage itself. One late night, as she sat again at the kitchen table, she realized she was no longer waiting for Mark to choose her, she was beginning to choose herself, and that subtle shift carried both fear and freedom, because clarity often arrives before confrontation, and as the clock ticked past midnight, Laura understood that the cracks in her marriage were no longer small fractures but deep lines that could not be smoothed over with excuses, and though she did not yet know how the truth would fully unfold, she sensed that the quiet strength growing inside her would guide her through whatever came next. The truth came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, without drama or warning, when Laura walked into the living room to grab her notebook and noticed Mark's tablet glowing on the couch, a soft notification lighting up the screen, and she would have ignored it like she always tried to ignore the small signs. But this time the message preview showed a woman's name she did not recognize, followed by words that were too warm, too personal to belong to a coworker, and her heart did not race the way she expected. Instead it slowed, as if bracing for impact, and she stood still for a moment before picking up the tablet with steady hands, telling herself she deserved clarity more than comfort. She did not scroll far because she did not need to. The tone of the messages said enough, the late-night exchanges, the private jokes, the plans to meet during his business trips, and in that quiet living room Laura felt the last piece of doubt fall away, replaced not by rage but by a deep, heavy sadness that settled into her chest like cold air. She placed the tablet back exactly where it had been and sat down, staring at the blank television screen, realizing that the fear she had carried for months had been preparing her for this moment, and strangely, she felt calmer than she had in weeks because uncertainty was finally replaced with truth. When Mark came home that evening, loosening his tie and greeting her with a distracted "Hey," she did not greet him back with a forced smile. Instead she walked to the couch, picked up the tablet, and placed it on the kitchen counter between them like a quiet piece of evidence, and for a second he looked confused until he saw the screen, and the color drained from his face. "Who is she?" Laura asked, her voice even, and the steadiness of her tone surprised them both because she had imagined this moment with tears and shouting, but now she felt composed, almost distant, as if she were watching someone else's life unfold. Mark opened his mouth to speak, started with a weak denial, then stopped because the messages were too clear, and after a long pause he admitted he had been seeing someone for months, that it had started casually, that he did not plan for it to grow, and Laura listened without interrupting, absorbing each word with quiet heartbreak. He said he felt disconnected, that he thought she was distant too, that work stress had pushed him away, but his explanation sounded hollow even to him, and Laura realized that sometimes people search for reasons to justify choices they already made. She asked him one simple question: "Why didn't you talk to me?" And he had no strong answer, only vague comments about not wanting conflict, about not knowing how to fix things, and in that moment she understood that their marriage had not ended in a single mistake but in months of silence, avoidance, and emotional drift. Ethan was upstairs during the conversation, and though they tried to keep their voices low, some words carried through the hallway, and Laura noticed him standing at the top of the stairs at one point, his expression tight with disappointment, and she felt a wave of guilt that he had to witness this unraveling, yet she also felt grateful that the truth was no longer hidden. The discussion stretched late into the night, not explosive but heavy, filled with long pauses and exhausted honesty, and when Mark finally said he did not know if he could repair what he had broken, Laura realized she did not want to beg him to try. Something inside her had shifted from desperation to dignity. The next morning, the house felt strangely peaceful, as if the storm had already passed, and Mark packed a suitcase without much conversation, saying he would stay at a friend's place for a while, and Laura watched quietly, understanding that space was necessary because pretending was no longer possible. After he left, the silence in the house felt different from before. It was no longer filled with suspicion but with clarity, and she sat at the kitchen table trying to process the reality that her marriage was likely over. Ethan came downstairs slowly, unsure of what to say, and when he saw her sitting there alone, he walked over and sat beside her without speaking, and the simple act of not avoiding the moment meant more than any speech could have. "I heard some of it," he admitted softly, and Laura nodded because there was no reason to hide anything now. She told him the truth in simple words, that his father had been involved with someone else, that adults sometimes make painful choices, and that none of it was Ethan's fault. He looked hurt but not surprised, and he said he hated that she had been treated that way, and though she appreciated his loyalty, she reminded him gently that Mark was still his father and that relationships are complicated, that people are flawed, and that anger would not solve anything. Over the next few days, practical matters replaced shock. Laura contacted a lawyer, reviewed finances, and began the slow process of separating their lives, and with each task she completed she felt a mix of grief and strength because action gave her back a sense of control. Mark called a few times, sounding uncertain and apologetic, but Laura no longer felt drawn into emotional circles. She spoke calmly, focusing on logistics rather than promises, and she realized that love cannot survive where trust has collapsed. Ethan stayed close during that week, helping around the house, checking in on her, and one evening as they washed dishes together in the same kitchen where his question had first changed everything, He said he wished things had turned out differently, and Laura replied that sometimes the truth hurts before it heals. She felt no bitterness toward Ethan, no confusion about their bond. What connected them was shared honesty and mutual respect, not misplaced feelings, and she understood that boundaries mattered more than ever now. When Mark officially moved out, taking the last of his clothes and closing the front door behind him, Laura stood in the living room and let herself cry for the first time since discovering the messages, not because she wanted him back but because she was mourning the version of life she had believed in, and Ethan quietly placed a hand on her shoulder, offering comfort without overstepping. That night, as she lay alone in her bed, she felt the ache of loss but also a small spark of relief because the waiting was over. She no longer had to question, no longer had to guess, and though the future looked uncertain, it felt honest, and she understood that the hardest part had not been the confession itself but the months of silence before it. The truth had not destroyed her, it had awakened her, and as she stared at the ceiling in the quiet house, she knew that while her marriage had ended, her sense of self was beginning to return, stronger and clearer than before. The weeks after Mark moved out passed quickly, not because they were easy but because Laura refused to stay still, and each morning she woke up in the quiet Chicago house with a tight chest yet a clear mind, determined to rebuild her life step by step. She met with her lawyer, sorted through bank statements, divided furniture, and signed documents she never imagined she would have to sign again. And though every paper felt like proof of failure, she reminded herself that choosing peace was not failure but strength. She threw herself into her work at the art gallery, arriving early, staying late, helping plan a new exhibition that filled the white walls with bold color and hopeful themes, and being surrounded by creativity gave her breathing space, because art did not judge, it simply existed, reminding her that broken things can still be beautiful. At home, she packed Mark's remaining items into boxes without anger, only finality, and when he came to collect them their conversation was polite and brief, two adults acknowledging what had ended without reopening wounds, and she felt a strange calm as the door closed behind him for what she knew was the last time as her husband. Ethan's return to Michigan approached, and the thought of the house becoming completely empty made her nervous. Yet she refused to let fear control her decisions. On his last evening before leaving, they stood once more in the kitchen where everything had shifted months earlier, and she noticed how different she felt now compared to the woman who had dropped a towel in shock that rainy night. "You're going to be okay," Ethan said gently, his suitcase already by the door, and she smiled, not the forced smile she had worn during her marriage's decline but a real one shaped by hard truth and quiet growth. "I am," she answered, and she meant it, because somewhere between heartbreak and paperwork she had found clarity. They talked openly about boundaries, about family, about respect, and she thanked him for being honest with her when she needed it most, explaining that his courage to ask difficult questions had helped her face reality instead of hiding from it. Ethan admitted he had worried about her but never doubted her strength, and hearing that from him felt like a blessing rather than a burden. When he hugged her goodbye, it was simple and warm, nothing complicated, just the embrace of two people who had walked through a painful chapter together without crossing lines, and as she watched him drive away she felt proud of both of them for choosing dignity over confusion. After he left, the silence in the house was deep, but it no longer felt heavy. She moved through the rooms slowly, touching walls, opening windows, letting fresh air in as if symbolically clearing the past. And within a month she made the decision to sell the house and move closer to Lake Michigan into a smaller apartment filled with light. The move felt symbolic, a fresh start in a space that belonged only to her, and she decorated it with her own choices, soft colors, framed prints from the gallery, plants near the window, and for the first time in years she arranged a home without worrying about someone else's opinion. The divorce finalized quietly, without drama. And though signing the final document brought a brief wave of sadness, it also brought relief because the waiting was truly over. She no longer defined herself as someone betrayed but as someone who survived and grew. She began therapy sessions to process the emotional layers she had carried for too long, learning that love should feel mutual, that compromise should not mean shrinking, and that loyalty matters more than convenience, and with each conversation she felt lighter, more aware of her worth. Weeks turned into months, and Laura slowly rediscovered parts of herself she had neglected, returning to painting. In the evenings, taking long walks by the lake at sunset, reconnecting with friends she had drifted from during her marriage, and she noticed that laughter came easier now, not because life was perfect but because she was no longer pretending. Ethan texted occasionally from Michigan, short messages asking how she was doing or sharing updates about classes, and their connection remained steady and respectful, built on honesty rather than dependency, and she felt grateful that their bond had become healthier through hardship instead of strained by it. One afternoon, standing by her apartment window watching sunlight reflect off the water, she reflected on how the entire journey had begun with one brave question in a quiet kitchen, and she realized that what felt like the beginning of scandal had actually been the beginning of self-respect. The infidelity had shattered her trust, yes, but it had also revealed who truly showed up when things fell apart. She no longer replayed the messages she had seen on the tablet, no longer wondered what she lacked, because she understood that another person's betrayal does not define her value. Instead, she focused on building a future rooted in clarity, promising herself that any love she accepted again would be built on openness and effort from both sides. On a cool autumn evening, as she arranged flowers on her small dining table, her phone buzzed with a simple text from Ethan, "Hope you're smiling today," and she looked around her bright apartment, at the art on the walls and the calm space she had created, and realized she truly was smiling, not because the past had not hurt but because she had moved beyond it with grace. Laura understood now that heartbreak can feel like an ending, but sometimes it is a doorway to a stronger version of yourself, and as she turned off the lights and prepared for bed in her peaceful new home, she felt something she had not felt in a long time, safety within her own heart, knowing that she had faced betrayal without losing her integrity, that she had protected boundaries while still allowing compassion, and that she had chosen growth over bitterness, and in that quiet certainty, she found a deeper kind of love, not the fragile kind dependent on someone else's promises, but the steady kind rooted in self-respect and hope for whatever chapter might come next.